In Memphis, and we run not only a gap year program, but we have started to do some other things too. We have a podcast, and we have a lecture series that we've done just recently that's going to come out next month. And I would love to plug that. I have brought a bunch of cards. They're on the table over there if you want to get one later on. It has my email address, has our website address on it. And also on the website, you can see the little trailer for this lecture series. It's a set of 18 10-minute lectures, give or take 30 seconds. And they're all about, they're geared for homeschool kids, but they could be used for Sunday school classes, that sort of thing. We were thinking maybe if people in small groups or in homeschool groups wanted to play one of them a week maybe, or one of them every other day, 2 or 3 times a week, something like that. You can listen to the 10-minute lecture, and then you can discuss with the questions that come with it. You can have a discussion for the rest of the hour. So it's about an hour's worth of material, I think, talked about in 10 minutes. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, grab one of these cards and go online, and you'll get to see the little trailer. It'll explain it far better than I just have. And you'll also get to see all of our podcasts. That's kind of loud, isn't it? Is that, yeah, either that or I need to move it away from my face. Okay, is that still okay? Can you hear me in the background? Okay, that's great, thank you. The podcast, we have 25 podcast episodes now on, which are just conversations about all sorts of different issues. We talked, one of them is called The Care and Feeding of the North American Millennial. We talked about all sorts of crazy things. Fascinating stuff. One of my other faculty members and I simply have a conversation. You can find those on the website. You can also find them if you look up From the Center. That's the name of the podcast. From the Center on iTunes. You can get it that way too. So if you have any questions about the center, I'd be glad to talk to you about them. We are looking forward to a new crop of students this fall. We go for basically the school year, starting with Labor Day, and we go through Memorial Day. And we walk through the great books. We start with Homer, and we work our way through to T.S. Eliot and G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis, and basically anybody that has 2 first initials. Hemingway and some other people too, so I suppose we skip that rule. We break that rule. Anyway, so we cover, there's only so much you can do in a year, but we cover a good deal of ground. And then in the spring, we rent an apartment in Paris and one in London, and we go over there and we go to the National Gallery and to the British Museum and see a show in the West End, and go to the Louvre Museum and the Orsay Museum and Chartres Cathedral and the Sainte-Chapelle and all sorts of marvelous things. You get to hear some concerts in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Like that. So it's a good chance for the students to establish a connection to the things that we've been talking about during the year. And the reason we started it was we just simply found so many young people that had gone through Christian schools would go off to college and lose their faith. And it's horrifying, frankly, the numbers. The numbers are far too low. In fact, Barna had a survey not too many years ago that said 50% of the students that grew up in Christian homes and went to Christian schools lost their faith when they go up to college. Now that's outrageous. What is going wrong? What's going on? Well, part of it, we think, is that they go to college and they find these colleges almost completely anti-Christian. That is, even if they don't hate Christians specifically, they're against the idea that faith has anything to do with learning, with academics. And that's simply wrong. That's simply, as my dad used to say, bass-ackward. It'll come to you in a minute. It was exactly wrong. It was completely 180 degrees out of phase. We actually, the reality is not just that faith and reason are reliable and engaged with each other. We argue that you can't actually do academics properly without faith. There's so much there to know that has to be taken by faith to begin with, and then can be studied. And the studies that follow faith, I think, are far more profound. So, at any rate, we try to give them the ammunition and the foundation so that they can go off to college and be secure in the knowledge that their education has been sound, has been reliable, and that if somebody tries to teach them that Christianity needs to be left at the door, well, they can just sort of laugh it off. They know better. And they can still learn a great deal from people who are not Christians if they have their sort of foundations underneath them. And that's what we want, for them to be able to sort of stand wherever they go. So that's the Center for Western Studies. I told you about the website. That's good. So tonight what I thought we'd talk about is beauty, the idea of beauty in the nature of God's economy. How is it God sees beauty? What's he got in mind when he created beautiful things? When he started, gave us the ability to make sense of beautiful things? How is it that God understands beauty? How do we understand what God intends for beauty? That kind of question. Does that make sense? Most people argue that there are three transcendentals that any good philosopher has to address: the good, the true, and the beautiful. And Christians often are very good at handling the good and the true, but not so much the beautiful, it seems to me. And the result is that we fall into a problem, a trap, really, and that is that beauty gives truth and goodness depth. And the result is, if you leave beauty out of the equation and hold on to the scriptural definitions for truth and for virtue, for goodness, which are far more clear in the Bible than beauty, what happens is truth and goodness actually lose their compelling nature in our hearts. The problem is the truth doesn't, it can, what I hear, I've spoken for L'Abri for many years. Some of you know Francis Schaeffer and the L'Abri organization. Well, I've spoken for them for many years, and I remember 20 years ago, and even maybe more, from the guys who were there 20 years before that, saying that the questions have changed over the years. That the things that people ask when they come to L'Abri are different now than they used to be. And back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even, maybe 80s at least, the questions were usually something like this. How do I know that the Bible is reliable? How do I know that Jesus really came out of the grave? How do we know that kind of thing? Well, how can you prove to me that this is really historically accurate or whatever like that, that the Bible is reliable? But nowadays, it seems that young people are asking this question instead. They're not saying, is the Bible reliable? They're saying, okay, so the Bible's reliable, so what? What does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with my life? Okay, so in other words, they're not arguing over the truth anymore. They can accept it as true in some way. That's a problem because the definition of truth is not very sound in their minds anymore. But never mind. They think if it's true, the only thing that matters to me is what effect it has on me. Okay, so he came out of the grave. Big deal. What's it got to do with me? That kind of question. Well, that's a question of personal application, sort of. You know what I mean? It's a question of relevance. What's the relevance of the thing? You see? And I think that's because beauty has been siphoned off for the last 150, 200 years. I think that's the reason. Because there's a theologian called Hans von Balthasar, I was telling one of the kids today, who argued that that if you leave beauty out of the equation, then the way he puts it is syllogisms will go clattering on, giving so many answers per minute, like a machine, but they'll no longer compel anybody to do anything. And that's what I'm saying. The truth is actually there, and everybody says, yeah, it's probably true, but who cares? And he says goodness, too, will lose its attractiveness. If you can lay out for somebody what's good and what's evil, and yet neither of them is attractive, then, beautiful, then the way Balthazar says is what's to make me want to do the good rather than the evil? This is in terms of sort of evangelism of the culture. Okay, people who are Christians and have a new heart have a love for God and have a desire now to serve Him. But if you're on the fence, or if you're before your decision before all that, and you're not born again, it's very difficult to make the Christian faith look meaningful to people simply by telling them that it's true or that it's good. That's just a hardship. It's a problem. And I think beauty has a word to say here, because what we need to be doing is painting a picture for people of what is attractive, what is beautiful. I was using this example earlier today too. I'm sort of away from my script. I'll read my talk in a minute. This is the introduction. The nature of beauty is that it draws you to it. I'm going to talk about why that happens in a minute, but it draws you to it. And if, for example, we wanted to be able to make an argument in the broader culture today about why we don't think it's a good idea to redefine marriage, for example, it's a big concern in a lot of our world today. Redefine marriage to allow for, say, homosexuals or any other kind of definition of marriage, which are coming down the pipe, by the way. They're coming. If we wanted to argue that, I'm saying, I think rather than saying, well, see, here in the Bible it says that we shouldn't do that. That's true. It does. And it is the Word of God, okay? So don't hear me underplaying that. It's the Word of God. But there's more in the Bible than just the command not to do certain things. And what we can do is embody the beauty of a healthy marriage. You see what I mean? And that actually, I think, weighs more heavily in the lives of today's culture than simply telling them don't do this and don't do that. It's not that the don'ts aren't important, please don't misunderstand me. It's just that they in and of themselves are no more or no less attractive. They're equally unattractive. All of those options are equally unattractive. And if somebody comes along and says, well, don't you want to be compassionate? Then that becomes attractive. And the compassionate argument is to let the definition of marriage be anything he wants to be. That would just include everybody. Isn't that a nice way to think? You see what I mean? That becomes the way, that becomes the approach that's compelling, because it seems beautiful, it seems inclusive, it seems warm, it seems kind. So I don't mean to get into that issue. We can talk about that issue if you want to, but that's not my point. My point is, how do you address an issue like that? And my argument is that we need to paint for them a picture of just how beautiful marriage can be, what it's supposed to be, and not the sort of broken marriages that we have in our day-to-day. It's a hard thing to do. So what I want to do is talk about the place of beauty in God's vision for the universe, for His vision for the world. And I want to start off by saying, I think that our culture doesn't understand fairy tales. I think that's the problem. We hear people saying that our teaching our children fairy tales leads them to be disappointed with reality. There really aren't any handsome princes, so stop letting your hair down so we can climb up. Frogs don't really become princes rather, so stop kissing them. There are no magic beanstalks that lead to castles and golden gooses, so stop swapping important things like cows for magic beans. There's a well-known musical called Into the Woods that interweaves the stories of all our favorite fairy tale characters, and they all live happily ever after at the end of Act 1. Then Act 2. In Act 2, reality sets in, and all of them run into terrible problems, the kind of problems that people run into in real life, not in fairy tales so much, like raising children, adultery, revenge, and all of it leads to the death of several characters. It's a very dark play, especially in the second act. The remaining characters try to pick up the pieces in their broken lives and teach a moral at the end that parents should be careful what they read to their children. Because their children might read fairy tales, and those will lead to unrealistic expectations. that can really disappoint our children as they become adults. So be careful. Don't tell them that everything's going to work out. Don't tell them that there's a happily ever after. Don't tell them that there's a handsome prince in your future. Better tell them the brutal truth early on so that they can get used to it. So that's what people say. So we instead give them loads of cop and detective shows on TV where truly evil and perverse things are described in detail for 45 minutes, and then in the last 15 minutes, the guilty parties are caught. Or in sitcoms, the bad guys are actually the lead characters. Have you noticed? And we root for them to get away with the adultery and the fornication and the stealing and lying, deceit and manipulation that they do, because the leads are all friends. Or they're all nerds. Or they all come from the wrong side of town, or they like kittens or something. G.K. Chesterton said, art is like morals. You have to draw the line somewhere. That's Chesterton for you, isn't that genius? Art is like morals. You have to draw the line somewhere. And fairy tales are a kind of art that deals with morals. So in fairy tales, lines are drawn in order to clarify and convey something very important. Reality. That's right, reality. That's what fairy tales are about. Did you know that? Fairy tales don't give a false picture of reality that needs to be grown out of as we become adults. Fairy tales depict a reality that we have forgotten. We've lost sight of it in the ongoing fiction that is adult life. Children like fairy tales because they can still see. They still know that reality is magical. Perhaps fairy tales are for the purpose of reminding us that the world is magical. We assume, for example, that the repetition of seasons, the daily rising of the sun, the regular grind of birth and life and death are necessities. They're necessary events. They're going to happen whether we like them or not, and there's nothing very special about them. Flowers always come up in the spring, birds always fly south in the winter, the sun always rises in the east, day follows day, season follows season, each generation passes and another takes its place. It's the boring grind of life. But in his great book, Orthodoxy, Chesterton, again, suggests that we have become dull to the wonders of this world. An adult, Chesterton talks about how a small child loves to be picked up and flipped over and put back down again. You've done that. You know, you pick him up, flip him over, put it down. He laughs and laughs and laughs, and then he says, do it again. He says, do it again. So you do it again, and he laughs and laughs, and then he says, do it again. And you do it again, and about the fourth time, you're ready to quit. But he's not ready to quit. He loves it. He wants to do it again and again. Well, Chesterton says, by the fourth time, he's tired of the game. The repetition becomes dull to me. It's boring. But to the child, the repetition is the fun of it. He doesn't think it's boring at all to do the same thing over and over again. He gets as much fun out of the 10th time as the first. Chesterton then suggests that repetition is actually not inherently boring. It's that we're too dull to enjoy it like a child does. Perhaps God, he says, is like the young child, enjoying sunrises and seasons and spring flowers so much that he says, do it again, and delights in it every time. I like daisies, do some more. I like the sunrise, do it again. Chesterton says, we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we are. He says that the purpose of fairy tales is to always remember that the world is magical. In fairy tales, impossible things happen. Princes become bears, pumpkins become carriages. But in reality, nothing like that ever happens, right? Wrong. In reality, eggs become chickens. In reality, apple blossoms become apple. In a fairy tale, you plant a magic bean and get a gigantic beanstalk, but in reality, you plant a kernel of corn and you get back an ear with hundreds of kernels. That's not anything but magic. How does that happen? Does anybody know how that happens? Do farmers even know how that happens? Don't get me wrong. They know how to do it. They know how to make it happen. But they can't actually know how it happens. It's magic. We think we know things. I'm more and more convinced that we know far less than we think. We think we know a lot of things. But what we know is how the world actually functions. We don't know why it functions that way. And we don't know actually the mechanism underneath it all that makes it happen. You can know more. You know to put the corn seed in the ground. You know to cover it up and fertilize it and water it and put sunlight on it and all the things that it needs. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know. But I mean, I'm guessing all those things. You know that, but you can no more make that kernel become a stalk of corn than fly to the moon. You yourself. Same thing with a doctor. You get a cut on your hand and you go in and the doctor puts something on it, stitches it up, puts a Band-Aid on it, whatever, and it heals, right? Do you think the doctor made it heal? The doctor only knows that this helps it heal. The actual knitting together of that cut is a miracle. I don't know how it does it. It just does. We just know it does. If all you ever knew were eggs, how in a million years would you ever predict a chicken? The only reason it doesn't seem magical to us is repetition. It happens the same way over and over again, and so we start to take it for granted. But you can't take it for granted. It's magic. Happens the same way all the time, predictable as clockwork. So we forget that there's a relation far more improbable between the egg and the chicken than there is between the prince and the bear. We've seen princes that have acted like bears. They're actually closer together. Who has seen an egg resemble in any way a chicken? Or an apple blossom an apple? Reality is freaky weird if you think about it. Far weirder than fairy tales. Fairy tales actually are only so strange. Reality actually is much stranger. And this is what the fairy tale does for us. See, this is the purpose of a fairy tale. It reminds us to be astonished. Chesterton says, quote, "These tales say that apples were golden only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found out that they were green. They make rivers run with wine only to make us remember for one wild moment that rivers run with water." Why do they run with water? They don't have to. They just do. What we all call common sense and rationality and practicality and positivism only means that for certain dead levels of our life, we forget that we have forgotten. All that we call spirit, though, and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful minute, we have remembered that we've forgotten. Let me say that again. This is a quote from Chesterton. All that we call common sense, rationality, practicality, positivism, only means that for certain dead levels of our life, when we explain things away like that, we forget that we have forgotten how things really are. All that we call, on the other hand, all that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful moment, we have remembered that we've forgotten. That's where we're hoping to be. That's what art does for us. That's what fairy tales do. It helps us see and remember that we've forgotten everything, that we've taken the important things for granted, that we've lost sight of the fact that we are alive at all and living in a world that's girded and suffused, I guess is the right word, infused with God's presence at every turn. and that this life really doesn't last very long. It's just that long. Just a few decades and we're done. Very important that we figure out why we're here. What happened? And that's what we've forgotten. And whose we are, I guess I should say too. There have been a lot of movies lately in the last 20 years about memory. Have you noticed? The lead character loses his memory, and with it he becomes forgetful of who his loves are and who his family is and what he does for a living and why he's here and all that sort of thing. That becomes a kind of a poignant plot to us. Maybe some of you have seen the Bourne Identity movies. You know, Bourne in that first movie is wonderful opening and I don't know, the first hour maybe of it or so. It's fascinating because he has all these skills, but he has no idea who he is and why he has them. My favorite of the movies of the last 20 years or so that have been about memory is Finding Nemo. Remember Finding Nemo? With Dory, the little fish that has a short-term memory loss problem, you know. It's hysterical. My wife says, finally they've got a character in a movie that's like me. She's so funny. But that's what Dory does, right? She says, oh good, let's go find your son or whatever. They go swimming off, right? And Dory's feeding her, and then he's trying to catch up with her, and eventually she starts slowing down and then she looks back and she spins off a little faster and he follows her and she slows down again. She turns to him and she says, why are you following me? She's forgotten all about where they were going or what they were doing, and it's completely gone, right? So, but that's a very poignant plot because that's how we are. You see, that's how we are. We have forgotten who we are. We've forgotten what we're here for. And the scripture teaches us what it is. But before the scripture does, the fairy tales do. Memory is essential to our lives as believers. Remember the last words that Moses gives the Israelites just before they go into the promised land? A land he knew he wouldn't be allowed to see. I think it's Deuteronomy 6, something like that. 6, 7, somewhere in there. He tells them, he has a last speech to them, and he tells them, don't forget. Remember, remember, remember. Remember what? Remember what God has done for you. Because in remembering what God has done for you, you will remember who you are. That's who you are. You are the redeemed of Israel. See? You're important. You're significant. Don't forget how he treated you in the desert. Don't forget. And then he says something very poignant. He says, when you go into the promised land, you're going to find houses that you didn't make, and you're going to find wells that you didn't dig, and you're going to find crops that you didn't plant. You're going to benefit immediately from the work of other people. You're going to be in good shape. It's going to be a land of milk and honey in many ways for you. And that's when you really have a danger of forgetting. It's when you have things going well that you begin to forget who it is that you belong to. So he said, always remember what the Lord has done for you, sustaining you in the desert, giving you his commandments, leading you here. People who have forgotten who they are need to be reminded regularly, and that's what fairy tales are about. Not to give a false, saccharine picture of life as an escape from reality, but to wake us up out of our cold slumbers so that we might always see the world and our lives as something extremely valuable and magical and awful. In the true sense of the word, full of awe. Tolkien was accused of writing escapist literature, you know, the Lord of the Rings. He was accused sometimes of writing escapist literature, they told him. But instead of denying the fact, which was what I would have done, no, it's not either, you know, he said, well, yeah, it's probably what it is. But then he said this, but there are two ways to escape. There's escaping into a fantasy from reality, and that would be a negative thing. That's not what I've written. He says, I've written an escape from prison. The reader is in a prison, and I've written him a way out. So escape, in that case, is an exodus, what everybody wants, what everybody hopes for. That's what he was aiming. He said he sees the Lord of the Rings as escape from prison of lies and evil into a world where truth reigns. Good and evil are clearly defined, and the good is depicted so beautifully. Here's my point from my introduction. that you would prefer it to evil, even if you have to suffer to have it. That's what we need to be doing. And this brings me to the topic at hand, beauty. How do you think beauty fits into God's design and his creation? Well, the scriptures do teach something about it. For example, Psalm 27, David says, one thing I ask of the Lord, in verse 4, one thing I ask of the Lord, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to do a particular thing. Do you remember what it is? To gaze upon the beauty of the Lord. That's the one thing his heart is for. Marvelous. And to worship in his sanctuary. The rest of it is to do that. To worship in his sanctuary. But what he longs for more than anything else, only one thing that he wants, to be able to look at the beauty of God. And I'm convinced that's how it is for us too. It's just that we look at beauty in this world and we have forgotten that that beauty is connected up to the beauty of God. He himself is what beauty is, in the same way that he is what truth is, and he is what goodness is. You know, when he talks about the truth, he doesn't say, I'll teach you the truth. He doesn't say, I'll lead you to the truth. He doesn't say, I will send you prophets that will teach you the truth. Jesus, I'm talking about. Jesus says, now I'm here. I am the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am what truth is. That still makes the little hairs on the back of my neck stand. He's not claiming, the Buddha would never have claimed to be the truth. Never. Allah, the Muslim God Allah, doesn't, not Allah, I mean Muhammad. The Muslim prophet Muhammad doesn't claim to be the truth. He never says that. That would be blasphemy. Nobody claims to be the truth, except people who have lost their minds, maybe. But no sane person ever claims to be the truth. Jesus is unique in that way. So he is what the truth is. He's also what goodness is. He himself embodies what goodness is. It's his character that is our definition of good. So, I'm arguing that in the same way, he is what beauty is. We could argue that he, in his triunity, has harmony, and that harmony is very much like anything that we find beautiful in this world. Anything we find beautiful in this world has some kind of harmony to it, by which I mean the elements in the thing, the painting, the film, the piece of music, the Rocky Mountains range, or the Grand Canyon. There's a certain harmony of things that draw us to it. The elements of it work together somehow to be beautiful. It's beautiful to see a tree grow. It's beautiful to see a plant grow. It's beautiful to see fish swimming. It's beautiful to see my golden retriever run. Have you ever seen? I'm not kidding. It's the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. When he's a young guy, he's 13 now, but when he was a young guy, man, he was lightning, and it was just beautiful. Just I can't. It's like ballet. It's really marvelous. So God Himself is harmonious within Himself, within the three and one person, God. And I think He created the world to look like Him. I'll tell you a quick story. I was praying one time, not too many months after I became a Christian, and I had been pondering, meditating on this idea of Trinity. And as you know, it's pretty bottomless. You can't get to the bottom of it. It's impossible. And I said, Lord, is there anything in the world that you could point me to that would help me understand the Trinity? And I actually felt like I heard a word back. It wasn't audible. It was an idea that came to me that I'd never thought of before. I had heard people give me pictures of the Trinity, like water, ice, and steam. You've heard of these things. But there's something wrong about that. That's modal. That's not one. That's three different aspects of water. It's true, but they're all separate. They're not at the same time. So it doesn't really. So what I think I heard was this. He said, it's not that there's only one thing that looks like me, it's that everything looks like me. And I thought, what are you talking about? Well, take a look at this book, for example. This book has 3 dimensions. It has height, it has width, and it has depth, right? It doesn't have 4 dimensions. There are only 3. And the weird thing is, it's only one book. It's not 3 books. However, if I were to reduce any one of those 3 dimensions to 0, let's say I made it, it stays the same width and it stays the same depth and it stays the same width, but I reduce the height of it down, until I get to just a millimeter, I get down to a micron, and then I get to absolute 0. Gone. The whole book is gone. This dimension's gone, this dimension's gone too, you see? Because these 2 can't exist if that one is not there. All 3 dimensions have to be present for it to stand as a 3-dimensional object in our material world. Well, I thought, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's weird that suddenly it looked like there was God's thumbprint on everything. Everything that he made suddenly was in 3 dimensions and it looked like him. Suddenly the entire creation looked like a really complicated, extremely expensive sermon illustration. So I'm arguing that I think what the Bible teaches is that God himself is beautiful. And the world that he's made reflects that beauty. And that means that for us to be able to see him properly, we need to see him through the material world. So when we see, C.S. Lewis talks about how the beauty comes from, not from the rose, but through the rose. You see that? When we look at a rose and we say, gee, that's beautiful, what we're really seeing is through the rose to the God who's beautiful, who's beyond it, who made it, and is reflected to a degree in it. So if you want to ask the question of the talk, what is beauty in God's economy? The answer is, beauty is the means, or a means, by which he draws us to himself. If we see the beauty in the object and not through the object to him, we're in danger of making the object an idol. And we can even make beauty itself, or the experience of beauty, into an idol. We like experiences and we want to repeat them over and over again, certain experiences. And that can turn that thing into an idol as well. So we should follow that God reveals himself in the beautiful. He does so through his revelation, both in the scriptures and in the world, in special revelation and in general revelation, we say. Special revelation in that he gives us beautiful stories, elegant poetry, masterful parables, analogies, metaphors, similes, and songs in the Bible. The Bible is full of all those things. Stories, poetry, parables, analogies, metaphors, similes, songs. In general revelation, that is the world around us, the heavens are telling the glory of God, I think. General revelation gives us sunsets, mountains, canyons, flowers, fish, good food, as well as the talents to make our own beauty in crafts and arts, which not only make our lives more comfortable, but delight our souls with beauty directly. So we are made in his image, and that means that we too are creative and create beauty. So how do we perceive this beauty? By our senses, but also by metaphoric connection. You know what metaphors are, right? A metaphor is something that combines 2 things together by the verb to be, basically. What light through yonder window breaks, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun. That's a metaphor. That's Shakespeare. Juliet is the sun. Well, the metaphoric connections that we see in this world are in order to connect what we know to what we don't know. We know that's Juliet, but we don't know that she's the sun. And Romeo tells us so. And when Romeo tells us so, he enlightens us, no pun intended, about everything, about how he feels about Juliet, how Juliet's beauty radiates from her face in much the same way that light and heat radiate from the sun or something. Very awkward to unpack metaphors. In fact, I was teaching this in a adult Sunday school class one time, and I said Juliet is the sun, and I unpacked it that way. Juliet's beauty radiates from her face in much the same way as light and heat radiate from the sun. And then I said, now, ladies, tell me the truth. Which would you rather hear? Juliet is the sun, or, and a lady in the front row elbowed her husband. She said, I'd take it either way. But that's what a metaphor is. Well, God uses metaphors too, see? In his revelation, he says things like, I am the bread. I am the vine, and you are the branches. I am the door. I am the way. I'm the path. You see? And then it dawned on me, well, all of these revelations of God to us are in metaphorical terms. Every time we hear about God, we're hearing about him in some kind of metaphor. He's always calling to mind a comparison of himself to an idea that we already understand, like kings or shepherds or whatever. You see? It's because language itself is metaphorical. And that means that God is actually using language and talking about himself metaphorically to us precisely because he knows that's the way we can understand it. It's a kind of love. It's a kind of kindness. Imagine the infinite God deigning to explain himself to me, to you. Who are we? Well, he loves us. That's who we are. We exist because he made us, but we know about it because he revealed himself to us. He wanted us to know who he is. What a kind God. What a loving God. To, in a sense, condescend. That's really the word. We shouldn't condescend to one another. We're all creatures. But God is not a creature. He's the creator. And what he does to speak to us this way is to condescend. But we should be grateful for that condescension, shouldn't we? So beauty in the world is one of the ways that he draws us to himself. He says, I am what is going to satisfy your heart. So I've laid beauty traps all through the world, you see, and you'll see them and you'll be smitten by them, and then I hope you will turn to me and say, thanks, I see you in this. And then that will be an expansion of who we are. I heard a guy say one time, reading great books, and it could be expanded to any kind of art, listening to great opera, listening to music, seeing paintings. Reading great books won't save your soul, and that's true. But then he says, but reading great books will make more of a soul there to be saved. It expands who you are. And that expansion happens because we're willing to allow God to teach us through his metaphorical word and through the metaphors in the creation and through then the art that we do by way of the creative gifts that he's given us in imitation of him. I want to read you a little bit of something from Jonathan Edwards. Our students have been reading Jonathan Edwards these last week or two. And I think a couple of quotes would serve our purposes for this lecture. Jonathan Edwards wrote a masterful essay called On the Nature of True Virtue. Anybody read it? Any of you guys read it? And some of our girls have read it, guys and girls have read it. Well, it's an amazing essay. I recommend it. It's not easy slogging, though, is it? It's tough wading. But let me give it a run. He said this, talking about these connections. He said, the reason, this is all a quote, it's a fairly long quote, but stick with me. The reason, or at least one reason, why God has made this kind of mutual agreement of things, and by that he means the relationship between the beauty of God and the beauty of what he calls secondary reality, creation. one reason, or at least one reason why God has made this kind of mutual agreement of things beautiful and grateful to those whose intelligent beings perceive it, probably is that there is in it some image of the true spiritual original beauty which has been spoken of, consisting in being's consent to being. I have to unpack that a little bit. God himself has always beed, right? Tenses get kind of squirrely when you start talking about eternal gods. But God has always been, right? He's eternal. But one of his characteristics is his love, Edward says, to being in general. He makes things, and then he loves what he makes. So the fact that the thing has existence now it makes it an object of his benevolence. It's the nature of God. That's how he is. So he says, it's one reason that God has made a link between himself and the beauty of the created order is that there in it is some kind of image of the true spiritual original beauty which has been spoken of in himself, consisting of being's consent to being, this relationship of two things that are in kind relation, or the union of spiritual beings and a mutual propensity and affection of heart. The other is an image of this, because by that uniformity, diverse things become, as it were, one. Diverse things become unified, as it is in this cordial union between God and his creation. And it pleases God to observe analogy in his works, as is manifest in the fact of innumerable instances, and especially to establish inferior things, that is, the created order, with analogy to superior things, that is, God himself. Thus, in how many instances has he formed groups, that is, animals, in analogy to human beings? You know, bears kind of look a little like, gorillas kind of look a little like human beings. How many times has he established that kind of thing, he says? And plants are in analogy to animals with respect to the manner of their generation and nutrition, etc. And so he has constituted the external world in analogy to the spiritual world, in numberless instances, as might be shown if it were necessary, and here were a proper place for it. Why such analogy in God's works pleased him, it's not needful now to inquire. We don't know why he liked it. Why such analogy pleases him, it's not needful now to inquire. It's sufficient that he makes an agreement of different things in their form, manner, measure, etc., to appear beautiful to us, because here is some image of a higher kind of agreement and consent of spiritual being. It has pleased him to establish a law of nature by virtue of which the uniformity and mutual correspondence of a beautiful plant and the respect which the various parts of a regular building seem to have to one another, and their agreement and union, and the consent or concord of the various notes of a tune, melodious tune, should appear beautiful, because therein is some image of the consent of mind, that is, the harmony of the different members of a society or system of intelligent beings, sweetly united in a benevolent agreement part. That's good old 18th century prose and stick waiting, I told you. But what he's saying is, God made things analogous to one another and seems to delight in that analogy, because in that analogy is a picture of the spiritual realities that we can't see. In other words, metaphoric relations between this world and the next. In the same way that, say, Paul says in Ephesians 5, this is what marriage looks like, and marriage is a picture of Christ and the church, right? Well, we wouldn't be able to see, literally perceive, Christ and the church if we didn't have a picture of it like this, manifesting it in our lives. And that should encourage us to want to make our marriages look as much like Christ and the church as possible, not just for our benefit, we're going to benefit from it, but for the rest of the world's benefit. They need to see it. They can't see it any other way. That's how he says analogies work. And then he says this, and here, by the way, I would further observe Probably it is with regard to this image or resemblance, which secondary beauty has of true spiritual beauty, that God has so constituted nature that the presenting of this inferior beauty, especially in those times of which it's the greatest resemblance of the primary beauty, as the harmony of sounds and the beauties of nature, have a tendency, get this, to assist those whose hearts are under the influence of a truly virtuous temper, to dispose them to the exercises of divine love. Does that make sense? You tracking with me? He says, I would observe that probably with regard to this image, this thing I'm telling you about, this relationship, I'll skip over the examples he gives, that those relationships have a tendency to assist those whose hearts are under the influence of a virtuous temper, to dispose them, those people, me, you, to the exercises of divine love yourselves. It encourages you to act in a loving manner yourself and enliven in them a sense of spiritual beauty. So if Edwards is right, he's sure that the metaphorical or allegorical relationships of physical objects to spiritual realities is not only a delight to God, it seems like a delight to him, but it's also a lesson for us to see through and not only at what we look at. Making this error will have the inevitable effect of our idolizing the object, like I said a minute ago. Or more still, beauty as an experience in ourselves. If we love beauty so much that we idolize beauty, then we've forgotten God and we only want the delight of the beauty itself, and that makes it an idol. So why is that? Here's Edwards again. Later on he says, though it be true that there is some analogy in it to spiritual and virtuous beauty, as far as material things can have analogy to spiritual things, of which they can have no more than a shadow, he says. It's only a shadow analogy, but it's still there. Yet, as has been observed, men do not approve it because of any such analogy perceived. And not only reason, but experience plainly shows that men's appropriation of this sort of beauty does not spring from any virtuous temper, and so has no connection with virtue. For otherwise, their delight in the beauty of squares and cubes and regular polygons or other beautiful things, beautiful pieces of embroidery and so on, would increase in proportion to men's virtue and would be raised in a great height in some eminently virtuous and holy men, but would almost wholly be lost in some others that are very vicious and lewd. And evidence, in fact, is that a relish of these things does not depend on general benevolence. In other words, virtuous people don't necessarily appreciate beauty. And any benevolence at all to any being whatsoever, any more than a man's loving a taste of honey or is being pleased with the smell of a rose. People like to taste honey and they like to smell roses, whether they're good or evil. So in other words, we talk about truth, goodness, and beauty. Goodness and beauty are separate things in this fallen world. So you might find people who are extremely virtuous that really don't appreciate or understand beauty. And the reverse, people who are truly evil, have done all sorts of horrible things, and yet love, opera or something. It seems like on every movie I've seen lately, the bad guy loves opera. You notice that? It seems like you go into his den and it's all very sophisticated, and he's playing, Lucia de Lammermoor or something in the background, and you come in, and the hero is somebody who's not paying any attention to that. I'm standing up for the right, And he said, "Oh, Mr. Bond, come and sit and have a good meal and listen to this wonderful music and blah, 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 before I kill you," or something. And he's petting a cat. He's my cat. I don't know why it is, but the Nazis were like that. For example, just giving you an example, they were doing heinous things, and yet they were probably the most sophisticated appreciators of art and beauty. They went around Europe stealing art. They stole, about all that? It's an amazing thing. Anyway, what I think his point here is good, though. You don't want to think that, I'm a good person, I don't like beauty. That doesn't work that way. Not necessarily. And the reverse doesn't work that way either. Just because you like beauty doesn't mean you're a good person. So I don't want you to think the wrong thing. It's a little like the quote I gave you a minute ago, that great books won't save your soul. Jesus can save your soul, but great books won't save your soul. But the great books have in them something that can make your soul larger. Your humanity will grow. So God intends for beauty to actually help your soul to grow, to make you a more profound person, make you understand him more fully. And that, my friends, is what we're really all here for. To glorify him and to enjoy him forever, right? That's what we're here for. That's what the purpose is. That's what we're all about. So we ought to turn to him and say, thank you, Lord, for the beauty that you've made in this world that calls us to you, that we come to on your account. So beauty draws us to him. We are to see beauty in material objects as a means to this further end and not an end in themselves. And he makes the creation itself beautiful and makes us able to perceive this beauty for one reason only, the same reason that he does anything, to bring glory to himself, redeem the world, call us to him. This is not at all self-absorbed on his part, by the way. He really is the best thing that ever happened to us. He really is God's gift to the world. None of us can say that, but he really can say that. And since by way of his creation we get to know him, by extension we get to know artists the way through their art. We get to know God through his creation and through his revelation there. We get to know our artists through the work that they do for us too. And that, after all, should be an imitation of our Lord. One last thing about fairy tales, and then I'll open it up to questions. In the fairy tale world, magic happens. But the magic usually hangs on one little provision. Have you noticed? The world will be perfectly okay as long as you don't open that box. And if you do, all the evils, all pandemonium, that's what that means, right? Pandemonium. All demons will come out. You have to be loved before the last petal of the rose falls. Why that? The girl has to guess Rumpelstiltskin's name or she'll lose her child. Why that? You can go to the ball and have a great time as long as you leave before midnight. Or then the coach will turn back into a pumpkin. You can eat any fruit you like, all except one. Or death will enter the world. You see? You see why these fairy tales are telling the truth? We live in a fairy tale. It's the exact same thing, only it's true. Fairy tales are stories, right? But this is a story that's true. This is the one that says you can eat any fruit that you like. Anything is all there for you. Enjoy it all. There's only one thing you can't eat. Don't eat that one. If you do, death will enter into the world. How is that any different than the seeming arbitrariness of fairy tale requirements like that? Gotta get home before midnight. You see? Cinderella never ever asks why she has to get home before midnight. That's just the way the story goes. You see? And that's what we're supposed to do too. On that level, we're supposed to say, "Aye, sir. I don't know why I can't eat that. I don't know why you've told me not to do this or that or the other thing. I don't know why necessarily. It even may seem arbitrary. It may even seem far more attractive than what you've told me to do. But if you know your fairy tales, you know you've got to get home before midnight because there's a reason, but you don't know what it is yet. See? So fairy tales not only open our eyes to the magic of the world, to remind us that the world is astonishing, but it also reminds us that there are what seem to be arbitrary rules, and that actually walking by faith in those rules is life. That's where life is. Learning to walk by faith. Doesn't mean to say that you don't find the answers later on, right? But it's always before you have to choose to do the right thing, and then he tells you about why. Maybe down the road, maybe not. Maybe not. But sometimes he does with me. I'm sure he does with you. So reality is actually like a fairy tale. And it makes sense as long as you obey the one thing that may seem arbitrary at the moment. And wisdom tells us to listen and obey. So that's my explanation about beauty. Thanks for listening. I'd be very happy to stay on and answer questions. If you've got ideas you want to wrestle with, and you want to disagree with me completely, it's perfectly okay. I'm in a safe place to say and anything you think you'd like to talk. If you need to leave, feel free to do. You won't have to. Don't bother us if you pick up a card on the way out. Pick up some of the other things on. It's like that Bryan College or something. Wonderful, wonderful. I'd like to read those myself. Yes, sir.
So I know God wants our worship to Him to be a thing where we recognize His value and beauty. But it seems like often there are circumstances where you just have to push through, where it's a duty thing. Any thoughts on that? Or how much we should be striving to make our duty beautiful and to see the beauty?
I guess I need to know what you mean by duty then. Tell me what you mean by. Give me an example of what duty.
Responsibilities.
A responsibility that's not beautiful. That's not beautiful to me, or how does it connect to beauty?
They don't feel beautiful because you're tired or something else that's on your mind.
Yeah, we're fatigued or we're distracted or and those duties need to be done, don't they? I mean, low on a small scale, that God certainly brush your teeth, go to bed or something, leave your teeth not taken care of. So I think there's plenty of things in a fallen world that are right to do and yet are not very fun and not very beautiful or entertaining or whatever. That's just part of growing up. Sadly, I think we teach our children that they should not do anything unless it's fun, including education, which is dangerous. To a degree, it's all you can do, but you want to learn to get out of that. And praise people for their hard work, doing something that goes against their brain a little bit, but they need to do something. It's a good question. Yes, sir.
Just kind of follow up. Don't you think that sometimes we can discover beauty in doing the things we don't want to do?
Yes, indeed. He's asking, can you find beauty in it actually by first being obedient and going on and doing what you're called to do? Then you find that it's actually, I find that with work generally, right? When you find it, you think, oh gosh, I really don't want to do that job. Okay, I'll make myself do it. And when you get into it, you can find something in it that's joyful, something in it about it that's worthwhile. Man, I can break these leaves and I can see a difference, or something. Yeah, I think it happens sometimes after the fact.
The example I think of is Isaiah 52, with regards to observing the Sabbath. It doesn't say observe the Sabbath when you delight in it, you'll observe the Sabbath. He says, honor me, call it a delight, and then you will. Yeah.
There's a deep truth in that too. I think it actually applies to our marriages. If you were married, you know what I'm talking about. When you get married, you think you're going to feel like this forever. It doesn't work. But that's not bad. It's not bad. Human beings just have ups and downs in their feelings. Their feelings go down. The beautiful thing about marriage, one of the things that's beautiful about it, is that you've cheated the devil. You've promised that you're going to hang in there even when things are on the downside. See? So nothing he throws at you is going to stop you. You're going to know that this will happen, and you just wait for the next up curve, and then all things will work out. But a lot of people, if they're connected to their feelings so much, and their feelings start to go down, they start thinking, well, maybe I married the wrong person, or maybe I shouldn't have done this, whatever. And it's usually not that way. It's just natural. Sometimes you have good days and bad days. Sometimes you have a stomach ache because of something you ate, and sometimes you don't. And life is just like that, right? It's a fallen world and all of that. So if you recognize on the front end that your action comes first, and then your feelings follow, then you be okay. And it's the same point of everything. I have no right to give marriage advice. None. Okay, that's not. My wife is great. That's why we're still. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you think is the place of dissonance and conflict in literature and music? Because it seems like that reflects evils in our world. So if the beauty of dissonance and conflict derives from God, then like will we have dissonance in our music during the eternal state?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is dissonance a somehow against God? Right? Is it not good? I don't think so. I guess maybe it seems to me that Christianity is the only worldview that I've ever heard of that explains how we can have a good world that's also broken. Because other religions either say everything was broken from the beginning, it's never been right, or they say everything was perfectly good and there hasn't been a fall. What's wrong with you? If you've got a problem, it's you, it's not the world. But we know that God made the world good, and that when he called it good, it really was good. But then in the fall has affected everything, damaged everything, touched everything. And so we have conflict and difficulty and all that stuff. Right? We were told right off that the world was not going to give up its fruit easily. The ground was going to be cursed. And so even making our livelihood, being able to make enough food to eat is going to be a trial. Living in a fallen world is a trial. So if you think of literature and film and music and all the arts as a means of communication, like a language, a bunch of different languages, then you can choose the language of poetry or the language of sculpture or something, and try and convey the human experience, the things that you have experienced or the things that you see others experience through that medium, so that they can be conveyed to somebody else. It's a means, it's a medium. That's what medium means, right? It's the thing that comes between small and large. Right? Small is a size and large is a size, but medium isn't a size. It's a thing that's between small. That's what medium means. It's in between something. And so a medium, we call the newspapers and the internet and so on media, don't we? The medium. Well, it's because they stand between the event that happened and the ears of the person they're trying to hear about. It's the thing in between. So that's what, isn't that right? That's what it is. Supposed to be. Was that? It's supposed to be. Supposed to be. Well, fair enough. Yeah, there's been a tough twist in there, isn't there? Anyway, because of that, the sculpture or the whatever the bit of art that you're making may be trying to describe a very real experience in a human being's life, which includes a lot of tension, a lot of dissonance, right? And so I ought to be able to craft something that would speak of that dissonance so that you and I both could acknowledge and communicate it to each other. So I don't find it inherently, I don't find dissonance inherently evil. I find it, by nature, a part of this world. Now, if you were to ask me what kind of art will we make in heaven, I don't know what I'll do about that. I don't know what that means. Maybe we have ways even now to craft things that are heavenly, that are like. But even then, there are. I guess that's beyond my pay grade. I can't imagine too much about what will happen in eternity. But I know in this world, we're communicating things that are not always just pristine. In fact, if you find that people are, you've seen artwork that does just sort of say everything's peachy keen, everything's just wonderful, right? And you think it's a little saccharine, it's a little shallow, right? And that's, I think, because it's lacking in dissonance or shadow or darkness or whatever, because those are actually part of our mind. Does that help? What do you think?
Halfway there.
Halfway there, yeah, okay.
I think because I see dissonance as seeing something beautiful.
Okay.
So I don't see it as evil.
Okay.
But I think I see it as beautiful in the context of resolutions. Right. In a sense, you need conflict before you can have resolution, right? The resolution doesn't always make sense. I'm not saying that there isn't such a thing as harmony without, that you need dissonance in order to know harmony. Harmony actually does exist, and dissonance is a twisting of that. Okay, I'm with you.
in this world, I think it's beautiful because it's telling the truth. Dismiss. So yeah, I'm in favor of it. I'm not. Other questions? Can I give you one quick example? I'll tell you, I wrote a piece. I'm a composer, I'm a conductor, and I've done a lot of church music. And I wrote a piece for chamber orchestra, chorus, and children's choir for Christmas. It was Christmas in time, many years ago, 7 movements. And I included in the story of Christmas, and I included in the story the slaughter of the children. Herod and the children. I'd never heard anybody do that before, but I thought, well, that's in there. Why don't we have to tell the whole story? And I wrote that movement. I really thought about that a long time. I took the Old Testament scripture that gets quoted in the New Testament. Rachel's weeping for her children, for they're no more. It's absolutely devastating. And I thought, how can you write music to that? What does it sound like? And what I ended up with was something that was almost atonal. It was almost without tonal center, not quite, but almost. And it's very difficult to listen to. It's not pretty to listen to. But I think it tells the truth. And I think that's what I was after. And that's not the final word even of the Christmas story, so there is a resolution, right? But those children were killed, and there were an awful lot of women weeping that husbands treated Rachel and her children. You have a question, or one of you.
Why do we love explosions and crushing things? How does that relate to art?
Is that beautiful somehow? I really love thunderstorms. You know what I mean? I love seeing them off in the distance, and I can feel a rumble. I feel it in my chest, rumbling, ground rumbling, lightning strikes. I love them. Car crashes, maybe not so much, but the thunderstorms I really get into. And I think it's because we long for something that's bigger than we are. We kind of like things that are awe-inspiring. You want to stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and go, oh, wow, And for some reason, only human beings do that. You don't see grizzly bears do that. They don't walk along the edge and go, what? They don't stop eating. You know what I mean? They just kind of rumble along. It's a hole. It's a big hole. But human beings do. Somehow we're awed by it. And that's good. That's a good thing. So I think that's why. That can get out of hand. Yes, ma'am.
Related question to you did earlier, and when we sing some of the songs from the Psalter,
yes,
some of the words are really terrible, hard things, but tune is a happy one.
I think beauty comes about partly by the coordination in our souls, in our apprehension of the form and the content together. And so if you find a song that is real chipper and happy and it's singing about death and destruction and all that, dashing babies' heads against rocks, like you find in the Psalms, it's incongruous to us and it doesn't fly. There's an old joke. Steve Martin used a banjo player. I don't know if Steve Martin, and he used to do a stand-up routine, and he had a banjo, and he would say, and he'd say, you just can't be sad when you're playing the banjo. And you go, oh, death and grief and sorrow and murder. Just like that. So it doesn't work. So yeah, I think we ought to be aware of what we're saying and how the music works. Most of the time we don't think about those things. Here's a tune that has the right number of notes in it for the rhythm of this line. I'm for all of you. More help. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Probably it began with a recent comment about saying that somebody who walks in and he has options good and evil, both are dull to him, both of them equally unattractive. Choose which is a big question, and you don't know which one he's going to has to be beautiful or attractive to begin with.
Right.
So I was trying to find the gap between how to make good beautiful or portray something good as beautiful to a young child or anybody else to guide him in that. So I didn't find that answer. I was still looking, or maybe you could point me in some direction that I could just pursue on later on.
That's a great point. Great question. I hope you all understood that I was saying it's not that good and evil are both dull. Good isn't dull, but it appears dull to us in this broken world sometimes, or it appears unattractive to us. And what we need to do is find ways to make it appear beautiful, because it is beautiful. Ultimately, it's just that we don't see it. We're the ones that are lacking. You understand? It's not it's lacking. We're the ones lacking. It's just that we've become dull and unable to relate to things. And then superficial things that are evil become attractive to us. My secretary starts to look kind of attractive to me, and I think, well, hang on a second. I'm forgetting my vows here. Stop. That's not the direction to go. But on the surface, it might seem, well, it'd be much better to go with somebody else than with my own wife, but I'm just making some fun. I've got no problems with secretaries. But I have a secretary now, I think of that. And I gotta fix that. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, your point though, your question is a really good one. My first thought was how in fairy tales, talking to children, in fairy tales, you have a princess, and the princess, think about Snow White, for example. You have a princess that's Snow White. She's white. She's white as snow. She's pure. She's perfect. She's a good person. See? And so she's not only virtuous, but she's made to seem attractive to the prince. And you relate to her. We all relate to her. And I guess the child actually gets the connection of those two things without sort of intuitively. And that story is a great one to tell the gospel. It is really the gospel. You know that story. This girl is hated by a queen who brings her a bit of fruit that's poison. It's fruit. She eats the fruit and dies, figuratively speaking. She falls asleep and can't be woken. And nobody can help her. All of her friends are as though they were impotent. They're midgets. And so we call them dwarves. They can't do anything for her, see? And let's pick a number that represents everything, all. So let's call them 7 dwarves. So we have 7 dwarves, and none of them can do anything. They all love her. They want to do something for her. They can't help her. See? The only one that can help her is the love of the prince, manifested in a kiss. And the prince, of course, is just the son of the king. So the son has to come and love her back to life, you see. It's just the gospel. That's all it is. It's what it is. So telling them stories like that at this young age, I think it collides. That's the wrong word. Elides maybe goodness and beauty together. She's attractive, and she's somebody everybody longs to help now. She's somebody we want to help. She's also a good person. Cinderella is another good one. She's hardworking and she's long-suffering. And she's beautiful, but we don't see it until the fairy godmother helps her out. But we see those two things together. Her goodness is rewarded in that story. At least that's a start. There are lots of other good. George MacDonald has some good stories. You know George MacDonald? I love his stories, young people's stories about goodness and beauty together. Question?
Kind of still tagging on to the music thing. I am sort of really into music theory, and so working and stuff like that. It's something that I really notice in music, and so with the song particularly, when we are singing something that's sad and it's happy, or vice versa, it should be happy when it's all minor. It's really kind of painful to me because it just seems wrong. In contrast, though, I was in choir once, and we got to sing a piece that was basically word for word the Ruth story. And it was brilliantly composed, and everything fit really well. It was really, really complicated and hard to do. out. Like you have the first one, and it goes in between the Blessed Man and in contrast to the so how do you balance those?
There are a lot more options in music than we think. I'll just give you one off the top of my head. It used to be that we chanted songs. Have you all some of you chant songs? Do you do that here? Yeah. Okay. Well, then it's just a chant tone. You know, the Lord is my shepherd; I shall not want. Like that. Right? And it doesn't matter in the sense. It's just repeating la 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 la, and everybody understands that. It's just that we're singing it instead of saying it. So that's just an extreme example, but that's one where it's, but we have a lot of sort of cliche expectations about music because we know major keys sound happy. That's not really true. I mean, that's just how we've kind of grown to be. And so we think of certain instruments as happy, like a banjo, or something, and maybe not the appropriate one for this. But music is much more profound than that. And as you study it, if you're a student of it, you know the different styles of different periods have been quite different in the way. One of the lectures I like to give is the difference between a Renaissance setting of a Mass and a Baroque setting. And the differences are astonishing. You know, where the Baroque composer is looking for every opportunity to express the words, and the Renaissance composer is looking for every opportunity to express the radiant harmonies. And the words almost don't matter. It's almost. So there's two extremes so keep thinking about how a particular song might be set. That would give the right structure for and the right to the mood, if you use the better word, for that thing. Let me give you a quick example. I used to write music for church, and I thought I knew a tune called Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness fills my breast. But sweeter still thy face to see, and in thy presence rest. Well, I really liked the words, but I thought the tune was only okay. So I thought, how can I set this thing in a way that explains the function of this very simple poem, but maybe has a more profound bit of song, and at the same time is singable. It's something that people could sing. It's not too complicated for the congregation to sing. You can't write things that are all offbeat and complicated rhythms and things and have the congregation feel like a congregation. So I wrote this tune. Let's see what you think. It goes, Jesus, the very thought of thee with its sweetness fills my breast. But sweeter still thy face to see, and in thy presence rest. And in thy presence rest. Like that? I'll send you a copy. You can use it. My blessing. But I just like the tune. And it's the word, but sweeter still, because the whole point is, this is wonderful, but this is even better. That's the point of the little poem, right? Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness still, like it does, but sweeter still to see. And I wanted that note to be higher. I wanted it to go, but then reach up to get that, and that's why it goes up. Very simple. There's nothing complicated about it, and it's easy to sing. You could probably sing it back to me right now. But it's a way of sort of taking into consideration the meaning of the words and how the music works. Yes, sir.
Good thing handle Messiah. I was struck by all we like sheep.
Oh yeah.
Astray.
Yes.
And that part of the song is sort of like a happy type thing. It's talking about us going astray. And at first I was thinking he was making a mistake, but I think in that part he's following around a little bit.
Right. I think you're right. Sure.
Then he gets that part that becomes very serious. Lord's causing
Yeah. Right.
So sometimes it's hard to tell what the composer is doing. And I seem to at first when we think.
Yeah.
I
didn't want to question Handel's ability.
The more you dig into that piece, the more you'll find that there is meaning in all of those things. You know, I usually use the tenor aria from my experiment, so I know you guys have heard this before. You know the tenor aria, every valley shall be exalted. But then he goes, shall be exalted. Like that. Well, what does exalted mean but to be lifted up, right? So the piece is going to be, that's what's going on. The crooked straight, and the rough places play. It's all in there. That's why. It's the tone painting you're just talking about. Sure, and if you go through the rest of Messiah, you'll see that. It's incredible. The Hallelujah chorus. The orchestra says Hallelujah. Did you know that? They go, Hallelujah, Hallelujah, and then the orchestra goes, da-da-dum-dum, and they go, Hallelujah, da-da-dum, 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 Hallelujah. So they're going, da-da-dum, da-da-dum. Well, the orchestra's going saying it too. It's like the whole world is going, Hallelujah at the same time. What a dude. Wrote it all in like 2.5 weeks. Okay, it's like 24/7 every day for about 2 weeks, and then he finished it. Spectacular. Yes, sir.
Was a guy wrote a book called Ishio, the Soul of Japan, and he described beauty as the most efficient way to do something.
Huh. Right. Oh, I see. Sure.
And so the most efficient movement is beautiful. He used several examples. I think one was like the tea ceremony. It's very simple, but it's very efficient. And then when you apply that to watching your dog run, your dog runs very efficiently. And it looks beautiful. And thus God does things efficiently. And then it appears less.
Well, that's interesting. Sure. I think that, things have a telos. Things have an end. They have a purpose. I mean, chief telos of man is to glorify God. Chief end of man. And if something is functioning well and efficiently toward its purpose, it's beautiful. Yeah. And if something is going against its purpose, its nature, things have natures, right? We talk about nature outside, but in reality, things have natures. Dogs have natures, cats have natures, humans have natures, things have natures. Well, if you're working in conjunction with the nature and working toward that nature's end, purpose of that thing, then it's beautiful to see. And if it's not, it's not. It may be momentarily spectacular, like an explosion, but it's not beautiful. Yeah, that's a good point. And the Japanese are really good at that too. They have, painting styles and poetry styles that are sort of reduced to the absolute minimum of gesture. You're supposed to learn how to paint a bamboo, what do you call those things? Stalk. Yeah. In one stroke, exactly. You want to do it all exactly the right way, and don't lift the paintbrush up. So that was the most efficient way. But it's also beautiful. One more question? We better wrap it up. Okay. I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks for coming, everybody. Thank you for having me.
One more thing. John, thanks for coming.
Yes, sir.
Very good lecture. The Institute is going to sponsor one more of these lectures this summer. On the third Wednesday of July, we'll have Doug Dalma here. Doug Dalma has recently published the authorized biography of Gordon Clark. And Gordon Clark is just a phenomenal philosopher, theologian. And Doug will be walking us through a little bit of that. How do we know what's truth all about, and how does it relate to Christian life? It should be another fascinating time. So again, thanks for coming out.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, look at that.